I'm starting here. This is the fourth session of early church history, and I want to focus on the fact that the church was victorious, and how and when did the church get victorious? Because remember, the church was being heavily persecuted in the Western Hemisphere for at least 2.5 centuries. Most of the first 3 centuries of the church, or at least the first 2.5 centuries. And most of what we study will be the church in the Western Hemisphere, the church in Europe, but there was serious Christian activity going on in Asia that we don't really know that much about, but there are records of Christian missionaries going as far as China by this time. At this point, we're getting into the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century in today's lesson. All right, we're in the beginning of the 4th century, but during these first 3 centuries, the church went eastward, and again, we don't know a lot about those different missionaries. We know that Thomas went into India. We know other missionaries went as far east as China, but there just aren't a lot of documents to tell us exactly what, a lot of detail as far as who these people were. But we do know that there were some people that were evangelizing churches in the east. There were established Jewish centers in the east, and much like Paul and other apostles in the west, there were people that went east and established churches, and they had ranks, and I say ranks, but they had offices like bishops and elders and things like that, just like they did in the west. And they did reach as far east as India and China. And there was a city, Edessa, which was the first openly, and it was they proclaimed themselves as a Christian city. And where
was that?
Edessa, I think that was in India, but I could be wrong on that. But I have that in my expanded notes here, that Edessa was an important Christian city. It was very similar to Antioch in that it became a missionary evangelist type city, sending out missionaries from then, and from there, and they went further east. And a lot of it's amazing how we can see the hand of God in everything. At the beginning of the 4th century, it's like a major shift in Christianity, whereas in 301, I don't think I have this in your notes, but in the year 301, Armenia became the first country or nation to proclaim itself as a Christian country. They had a Christian king, and they openly proclaimed themselves as a Christian country. This was before Constantine, which we're going to talk about today. But in the east, there already was a Christian country just on the east edge of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that was in 301. There were established Jewish centers in the east, and originally the gospel went to these established Jewish centers and went out from there. Okay, the story goes that King Abgar V of Edessa asked Jesus to come and heal him, to which appeal he did receive a reply. And it is said that Thomas sent Thaddeus to the king, which resulted in the city becoming Christianized. And from there they sent missionaries to Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. And so by the middle of the 2nd century, there were a lot of Christian churches in the east. Okay, so that as just a background, because occasionally we're going to talk a lot about the church in the West, but occasionally I want to throw in a few things that I read about things going on in the East or other parts of the world, instead of always only focusing on Europe. Okay, so what happened in the year 306? In the year 306, the Roman army proclaimed Augustine to be the emperor. What happened was Constantine's father was the emperor of the West. Now let me back up a little bit further. There were, I've got additional notes on my iPad, but I guess I left that in the back. But there was Augustine's father. Let me back up a little bit further, because I'm going to leave part of the story out if I don't tell you the whole thing. Diocletian was the emperor in the East, a very bloody, brutal man, and he had, right after him, it was Galatius, right? That was the man that followed after him. Yeah, Galerius, that became equally brutal, persecuting the church. And there was the empire had gotten so large. Thank you. The empire had gotten so large that they had kind of a friendly split. It wasn't, they still considered themselves one empire, but they split in two because they just felt like it was too big to manage. So they had Galerius ruling the East, and he appointed Constantius, who is the father of Constantine, to rule the West. Well, Constantius died in the year 306, and the Roman army, the Roman army in Britain proclaimed Constantine the new emperor. They just assumed, I guess, that he would take over for his father. But Galerius had different ideas. He had another man in mind, his nephew, Maxentius, that he appointed in the West. So the West ended up being split. Okay, so now the empire is split in three parts. There's the East, and then the West is divided between the North and the South. Constantine was ruling over Britain, Gaul, and Spain, and Maxentius was ruling over Italy and North Africa. Well, neither one were satisfied with that, of course. And keep in mind, this is right after in 301 when Armenia declared itself to be a Christian nation. And then 306, Constantine is at least partially an emperor. I think the title they actually gave him was Augustus, I read in one book. But in the year 311, we know that Galerius proclaimed his Edict of Galerius, in which really just impacted the Eastern Roman Empire, allowing the Christians to hold their church services, but it didn't completely end persecution. But then after the death of Galerius, Maxentius wanted more power than before. Another one of Galerius's son-in-laws took over the rule of the East. I'm going to misstate his name, Licetius or something like that. I'm sure I'm brutalizing his name. But so two different sons-in-law of Galerius were ruling much of the Roman Empire, and then there was Constantine. Well, in the year 311, or actually 312, more and more openly, Maxentius showed hostility towards Constantine, and Constantine saw a need for supernatural intervention at the brink of war because he was outnumbered 3-1. So Now, Constantine was a worshiper of Mithra, the Persian sun god, said to be a great fighter and champion of truth and justice. Mithra was, most of all, a soldier's god. Mithraism, at that time, had a large following in the Roman Empire, but Constantine saw a cross above the sun as it was setting in the west, with the letters on it that bore the words, "In this sign conquer." That's the English translation of it anyway. "In this sign conquer." And he told God that since he was outnumbered 3-1 and it was basically impossible, humanly impossible for him to win this fight, he told God that if he were to win this battle, which looked impossible, but if he were to win it, he would become a Christian. You know, a lot of times people are in a desperate situation where they make promises to God. Well, Constantine kept this promise. Many times people, when they're close to facing death, they'll make promises like this and then end up not keeping the promise. But he did keep the promise, and he did become a Christian. Now, many people say he was a Christian in name only, and who knows what's in a person's heart. Certainly some of his deeds were reflecting a flawed character even after becoming a Christian. But the radical change in society because of Constantine and his actions leads me to believe that he was sincere, but he was still flawed. he was still a very flawed human. All right, so there was a furious battle on October 28th in the year 312, and the entire army of Maxentius was completely defeated, a seemingly impossible feat. Maxentius himself, attempting to escape, drowned in the Tiber River. And the outcome made Constantine master of the entire western part of the Roman Empire. And Constantine felt like he had won the battle because he received help from the God of the Christians. He had been a worshiper of the sun god Mithra, but now he embraced Christ, who was the true light of the world. So all this happened in this is 312. And then in the year 313 was the Edict of Milan. Now in the city of Milan, in 313, Constantine issued an edict concerning religion. The edict didn't set up Christianity as the only or official religion, although many people say that it did. In reality, it did not do that, or that wasn't the intent anyway. It did not forbid any heathen religions, but what it did was it was granting toleration of Christianity or any other religion, tolerating all religions, similar as the decree of Galerius did in 311. So the Edict of Milan allowed people to worship whoever, whatever, whenever, however they want. At least that's the way it was written. That was its intent. But in practice, it really wasn't practiced that way, because I think I might have mentioned to you guys last week that there's a story about him. You know, the Jews in Jerusalem found out they could have freedom of religion, so they started to rebuild the temple, and Constantine apparently didn't like it, so he sent some people down there to cut off the ears of the builders. So much for freedom of religion. So in practice, he really did embrace Christianity and promote Christianity to the degree that he sent the church thousands and thousands of dollars and granted favors to bishops and clergy, exempting them from taxes, exempting them from military service. And so it was really was embracing Christianity. Okay, so the agreement, the Edict of Milan put a stop to the persecution altogether and proclaimed absolute freedom of conscience. It placed Christianity upon footing of equality before equal with, but actually above, in reality, other religions of the empire. The agreement shifted Christianity from being illegal and persecuted and to making it welcomed and soon the dominant religion of the empire. So the Edict of Milan in the year 313 marks the victory of the church over heathenism. So 313 is a very important year in Christianity, because persecution against the church pretty much came to a complete stop, at least in the Roman Empire. There may have been other parts of the world where people were still being persecuted, but it ended the persecution against Christianity for now. There will come a time, which we'll talk about in the future, where Christians start persecuting other Christians. So the persecution does pick up again to some degree, but it never does again get as brutal as it was for those 250 years at the beginning of the church age. From 64 till 313 was the most intense persecution I think that the church had ever faced. So the church's victory is a marvel. Okay, the church's victory is a marvel. This victory of the church is one of the most marvelous things in church history. The church had its beginning as a very small organization only 300 years before. It was composed of people who belonged to small and despised Jewish nation and a few Gentiles. Many members of this organization were poor, people without education or prestige. The message which the church brought was, to many who heard it, either a stumbling block or foolishness. Arrayed against the church were overwhelming numbers, money, learning, culture, social prestige, political and military power. The whole world at that time, Jews and Gentiles, the mighty army, the mighty Roman Empire, all seemed to be against the church for the previous 300 years, or much of that time. Not infrequently, the church was disgraced by serious moral lapses by some of its members. It was rent asunder over questions of discipline and harassed from without, and by strange doctrines and deadly heresies from within. So it was distressed within by heated and bitter controversies over questions touching the very heart of its message. In the midst of these unfavorable conditions, which one would think would have stopped all growth, the church for 300 years was subjected to fierce and bloody persecution, yet they continued to flourish, they continued to grow. So how is it possible for the church to emerge victorious from all these conflicts? The more martyr bloodshed, the more the church grew and flourished. Only one reasonable answer: Christ's supernatural care for his church. The church's existence is a marvel. Again, if you think of all the things that came against the church thus far, and yet for it to survive and flourish and now be victorious in the Roman Empire seems to be the hand of God controlling the series of events. And, it's Romans 8:28. Certainly a lot of mistakes were made, but Romans 8:28 is something that I always fall back on. God causes things to work together for the good. The scripture says in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for the good to those that love God. That means even our mistakes. There certainly were a lot of mistakes that the Christians were making in that 300-year period, but God by his Holy Spirit, would still work behind the scene to cause things to work out for the good to the Christians, in spite of themselves. So 313 is a turning point in the history of the church. The year 313 was a very decisive turning point in the history of the church. There now sat upon the throne of the empire a man who confessed Christianity. However, his personal life left much to be desired and has caused some to doubt the sincerity of his confession. Instead of persecuting the church, Constantine showed favors. He showered favors upon it. The Christian clergy, as I already said, was relieved of certain unpleasant civil duties. Constantine gave them large grants of money. In Constantinople, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and other places, he erected magnificent church buildings. Now, keep in mind, up until this point, there were some church buildings, but very few, and the church buildings that did exist during that age of persecution were very simple buildings, plain buildings. But largely, during the age of persecution, people were meeting in homes because much of that time Christianity was illegal. But now that it's legal, and not only legal, it's being celebrated and being promoted, and hundreds and thousands of people are entering into the church, because now, under Constantine, if you want to get anywhere in life, you better call yourself a Christian. It's like you whether you're truly one or not, you need to say you are and make that appearance in church so that people will see that you're a Christian. So many people were certainly becoming Christian in name, but the true impact on their heart, well, that's between them and God. We don't know, but it certainly became popular to become a Christian, and he created all these magnificent church buildings. One of the outstanding features of Christianity was the observance of Sunday as a weekly sacred day. Constantine now would forbid Sunday work by some professions. Another thing that began to happen is emperors, beginning with Constantine and the next couple of emperors after him, kissing the wounds created by previous emperors. Okay, just the previous emperors were persecuting Christians, and now that we have all these bishops and other Christians with scars and all kinds of wounds, and now the emperor would frequently kiss the wounds of these people that had been brutalized by the previous emperors. So, with the victory of Constantine and the Edict of Milan, there's good and there's bad. The good is now you can worship openly and freely, and you can evangelize, and you can proclaim your belief without fear of persecution from the church. But the bad side is Christianity became so popular, the world invades the church. We see this to some degree in society today, where the world invades many churches today. But this was something that was, it was no longer a shame, but an honor to be a Christian. So the Christian name now secured many and great material advantages. The Christian name had become somewhat of a passport to political, military, and social promotion. And thousands upon thousands of heathen joined the church for the fringe benefits. So many were Christians in name only, with no true born-again experience. The Christianity of the emperor was not of a very high character. So what the church gained in quantity, it certainly lost in quality. A mighty stream of corruption poured into the church, and we'll talk about some of the corruption, some of the major problems that flooded into the church. Probably next week we'll probably talk about some of those, many of those. the next couple of weeks. But the contrast in church character. The church had existed and extended by peaceful means for nearly 300 years. The victory over heathenism was won not by fighting, but by enduring suffering. After 313, Christians at times employed the methods of war to advance their causes. And again, this is something we're going to see over the next few hundred years as we go through church history. Christian emperors or even popes setting up armies to fight each other. So there's a lot of very questionable activity that takes place within Christianity for the next few hundred years. So Christianity at times employed methods of war to advance their cause. The emblem of the Roman armies had been the eagle, but now the eagle was replaced by the cross. The relation between the church and the state. Constantine had granted the church freedom of religion and many favors. In turn, he demanded that the church should allow him to have a great deal of say in the church affairs. So Constantine started getting involved in some of the decisions of the church, and over the next several hundred years, the mixture of church and state, or the boundary between church and state, seemed blurred from over much of the next few hundred years. It was Constantine. We're going to talk, probably not today. We'll see how time goes. It'll probably be next week. We'll talk about the Nicene Council. It was Constantine that called for the Nicene Council. The Nicene Council was the council where the church settled the issue whether or not Jesus is God or not. The argument was Arius was promoting the idea that, and he was a bishop, he was promoting the idea that Jesus was the first and highest created being of God. He referred to him as the Son of God, but he said he was not God. He was not equal with God. He was the first and highest created being of God. Many of us would call that heresy. And other people in the church were saying Jesus is God. He's 100% God. So it was Constantine that wanted to settle this issue. So we see Constantine's involvement in the church. He's the one that called for the Council of Nicaea to settle this issue and brought in bishops from all over the empire to come and debate this issue. Anyway, we'll get to that probably next week. We'll talk about that. But I wanted to point out that the church-state relationship has been the occasion of much disagreement, strife, and even bloodshed over the next few hundred years after this. So most of the emperors over the next couple hundred years were Christian in name, if not in practice, except for there was one that was very anti-Christian. And some emperors would, just like under the age of persecution, there were some emperors who just didn't take a position and they perhaps just continued the practices of their predecessor. Even now, under a Christianized Roman Empire, some men would come to power and they don't really have a strong Christian faith, but they'll just continue the policies of their predecessor. Well, there's a man by the name of Julian. He's referred to in history as Julian the Apostate. And his objective was to revive heathenism. He actually was the nephew of the great Constantine. That in the year 361, he became emperor, a nephew of Constantine. And he grew up in a Christian family. He was brought up as a Christian. I mean, basically, after Constantine, everyone was a Christian, in name at least. But he was brought up in a Christian home, but he remained a pagan at heart. And now that he was emperor, he wanted to have nothing to do with Christianity, and he made it known that he was a heathen. So once again, the Roman Empire had a heathen emperor, and he became known as Julian the Apostate. And Julian the Apostate, fortunately, he was only emperor for 2 years, although he engaged a certain amount of persecution. It was mostly satire and ridicule. Julian did his best to breathe new life into heathenism, but he failed. The heathen temples stood forsaken, and the heathen altars smoked no more. Heathenism was dead. In the year 363, 50 years after Constantine the Great had announced his famous Edict of Milan, Julian the Apostate fell in battle against the Persians, mortally wounded in the thigh by a spear. And it is said that his dying words were, "So thou hast conquered after all, Galilean," of course referring to Christ. So in his dying words, he acknowledges Christ has won. Okay. All right, well, I went through that quicker than I anticipated, so let me go on a little bit further and talk about, and this, I know I don't have this in your notes, but yes.
We had quickly gone through, you said the symbol was an eagle and it became the cross.
Yeah.
What group was that?
That was the Western Roman Empire.
The Western Roman Empire.
Yeah. Under Constantine, I guess before Constantine, the symbol that they had on their flags and on their banners was the eagle, but now they replaced it with the cross. Okay, they were very, very openly proclaiming Christianity as their religion. Okay, so if you're reading the church history books, that thicker one is the one, I'm pretty much following it as my, you could almost just bring it every week to be your outline. Basically, I'm following that thick book as my outline. And after talking about the different things with Constantine, it goes on to talk, the next section talks about the church councils. And for the next few minutes, I'll talk about that first church council. Actually, the first church council is in Acts chapter 15. Remember, in Acts chapter 15, we haven't gotten that far yet, have we? What chapter did you teach on today?
We finished with 8.
Okay. All right. So that makes sense. All right. But in Acts chapter 15, we know that the Apostle Paul had gone to Galatia before 15 and evangelized, and he would always go to the Jews first, and they would usually reject him, so he'd go to the Gentiles and get them saved and Spirit-filled, speaking in tongues, and he would proclaim grace to them. And then he went back to Antioch, and the Judaizers followed behind him and telling them, yes, salvation by grace and everything, but Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and so you still have to follow the Jewish law. You still need to be circumcised. You still need to do this or do that. You need to follow the Jewish rituals and everything. But when word got back to Paul about this, he was, of course, very upset about that. And they had a big church council in Jerusalem. This was probably right around the year 45. I don't know for sure the exact year, but I'm guessing right around the year 45. And Peter got up and talked about how the Gentiles came upon the Holy Spirit came upon the Gentiles in Caesarea, and Paul shared his testimony, and Barnabas shared his testimony, and ultimately James stands up and speaks, and this is not James the apostle, because he was already executed in chapter 12. This is James, the brother of Jesus, who seems to have taken the leadership, the pastoral leadership of the church in Jerusalem, and he proclaims that indeed salvation is by grace, and we should not put a burden on the Gentiles that God's not putting on them, apparently, because they were receiving the Holy Spirit baptism apart from works of the law. And, so anyway, that was the first church council in the book of Acts, chapter 15. All the important players were there, the important leaders of the church, and they settled the issue of salvation by grace through faith. So now in the next church council, some people may call this the first church council, but in reality it's the second, in the year 325 in Nicaea. First of all, when we talk about a church council, what are we talking about? A church council is the meetings of church leaders where important questions were discussed, advice was carefully given, and decisions were made. The church council of the apostles in Jerusalem in Acts 15 was the first, discussing the issues of Gentile salvation by grace. The book actually talks about 3 different kinds of church councils, but the only one I'm really concerned about are what they refer to as ecumenical councils or general councils, because that's the one where it's open to all the bishops or all the church leaders to come. And again, the word bishop was used differently then than what it is now. The word bishop was basically what we would call pastor. They didn't really use the word pastor in the first 3 centuries of the church. From what I can see, they would call their pastors bishops. And so all the bishops were invited to this council at Nicaea, and when all the bishops are invited, all the bishops of the empire or all bishops of the world, if they know about it, are invited to these ecumenical church councils. Anyway, the subject came up of, and it was a major debate in the church. It still is among some in the church. We call Jesus the Son of God, but what does that mean? I think all Christians agree Jesus is the Son of God. But to some people, that kind of implies that he's less than God. But I believe, and I think most Christians believe, that really means that he is God in the flesh. So the question was for Nicaea is, and this was an issue that Constantine himself was battling with. Okay, so the fact that he would engage in debates like this and want to know the truth is one of those things which leads me to believe that he was a sincere Christian. Very flawed character, but he was a sincere Christian, I believe. He wanted to know the truth. Is Jesus God, or does the son of the... He had gotten in touch with the teachings of Arius, and Arius was a bishop. Let me see if I can find him on my notes. Arius was a bishop, and I don't see the city that he was a bishop in, but I'll probably come across here. But this was the controversy. Arius was teaching Jesus is the first and highest created being of God, but he had a young man by the name of Athanasius. Now, Athanasius was, and I'll include this in my notes next week so you can get the correct spelling of it, or it's in probably chapter 5 of the thicker book. But Athanasius was actually, he was, I think, employed by or discipled by Arius. Arius was an older man. Athanasius was a younger man. But they disagreed on this one subject. They may have agreed on virtually everything else, but they disagreed on this one subject. And it became pretty much a major division between these two men. And Constantine called for a church council to settle the issue. And these were the two men that headed up the arguments. I'm sure there were other people involved in the debates too, but Arius, if you hear someone referred to as an Arian Christian, an Arian by faith, they're referring to them being as a follower of Arius. Okay, and it implies that they don't believe that Jesus is God. They'll say he's the Son of God, but they always want to make him slightly less than God himself. But Athanasius was leading the fight, promoting the idea that Jesus is God. Jesus is fully God, 100% God, God manifested in the flesh. Now, Arius was far advanced in years. He was a great preacher of the day and was considered a pious man with a blameless life. And the heathens believed in many gods. And Arius, his main argument was, one argument that he had was that to say that Jesus is God means that we have two gods. That's what he thought. And that makes us no different than the heathen because they have many gods. So Arius thought that if the church were to adopt the belief that Jesus is God, they'd be falling back into heathenism. That was the argument that he was making. He referred to Christ as the first and highest created being, not existing from eternity past. But Athanasius insisted that Jesus is God. He's God himself, God taking on flesh, manifesting as a human. And it's a question of vital and lasting importance. And we could get into a discussion as to why Jesus is God, but ultimately in that Council of Nicaea, they did the bishops at some point. I guess I assume they voted, and they agreed with. The vast majority of them agreed with Athanasius that Jesus is God. And the book tells us that, this is Constantine's doing. He called this general council to settle this dispute in 325. The year was 325 in Nicaea. And it was in a setting of pomp and splendor. More than 300 bishops met in the emperor's palace. And among the bishops were many who had been tortured greatly for their faith in Christ. And the outcome of the proceedings was the view of Arius was condemned as heresy. A statement of the true doctrine of the person of Jesus Christ was adopted as the faith of the church. And that statement elaborated and refined and was refined by later councils. But they put together what they called the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed was the first written creed of the church. The creed of the church confesses that Christ is very God of very gods, begotten, not created, and equal with the Father. The deity of Christ is a most